Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Political Vigilante. My name is Graham Elwood. We have a very special guest here today, the author of Authority, Bruce E. Levine. Bruce, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great here.
Well, thank you for taking time out to be on the show. One of our viewers turned me on to you and some of your work. Why don't you go into telling us about what this book is, Resisting Illegitimate Authority, to writing that book?
Sure. It's a book about anti-authoritarians, and it's really a book for them, too, as well. And really, I guess one of the things that I should do before we get any further on that, those words, authoritarian, anti-authoritarian, a lot of people don't know what they mean, really. So authoritarian really just means an unquestioning obedience to authority. That's really what an authoritarian is. I give a lot of specific definitions, but just to kind of give the sensibility of an authoritarian, I have a quote by Lyndon Johnson, who's a Democratic authoritarian president, who said, I love this quote, he was talking about what he was looking for in an appointee, and he said, I want him to be able to kiss my ass in Macy's window and tell me, I'll kiss my ass at high noon in Macy's window and tell me it smells like roses. I thought that really captured it, because it was not only Lyndon Johnson, not only is that's an authoritarian sensibility, but it's also those ass kissers are also authoritarians. So anybody who if that's okay for them to get ahead in life, to kiss people's ass, those are authoritarians. And so in contrast, my group, who I care about, are anti-authoritarians, and these are people who, they're not necessarily all anti-all authority, and we could get into that, but they question whether an authority is legitimate before taking it seriously. And if that authority is dishonest, they don't know what they're talking about, they're exploitative, they don't care about people who are trusting them, all those things, if they assess that authority to be illegitimate, then an anti-authoritarian is going to challenge and resist and disobey that authority. And that's who I care about, anti-authoritarians. And so in the book, I talk about a lot of famous, non-famous anti-authoritarians, really, trying to have some degree of diversity in terms of different ideologies, different personalities. And we can get into more a little bit later how all the steps that came to writing that book. But that's a lot about what I care most about these days, anti-authoritarians.
And so you're a psychologist, correct?
Yes, and an embarrassed psychologist, I should say. I'm embarrassed about my entire profession. It's not quite as bad as being a psychiatrist. At least I'm not, drugging little kids who are not paying attention to boring teachers. Okay, so it's not quite that bad. But part of one chapter in the book is the psychiatric assault on anti-authoritarians. So there are a handful of dissident psychologists and psychiatrists, just like there are dissident people like Edward Snowden at the NSA. But overall, I see my profession as really being assaulting and also marginalizing a lot of anti-authoritarians. So I throw that in real quickly because anybody who's watching the show, if I was watching the show and I was watching you interview a psychologist, I'd immediately turn it off unless somebody said something like I just said.
Well, I want to get into that a little bit because I watched some interviews with you online and you drew some really amazing conclusions. One of the things we do on this show is I always talk about try to connect the dots of how those in power try to assert their power and try to sell us stuff, propaganda, whatever. And one of the things you have talked about is the medication of kids who are basically just acting like kids. Especially when you become an adolescent, you start questioning everything. That's kind of what that process is in the human span of life. And you're saying that the pharmaceutical companies you explain it, because I want our viewers to know exactly what you mean when you were talking about that.
Sure. People out there, I don't think this is new to a lot of your viewers, but it is to a lot of Americans, that everything out there is pretty political. And my profession looks scientific. They try to look scientific because you get a certain level of authority prestige. But a lot of what these diagnoses are and a lot of the treatments become very political, very cultural. So when you had a more anti-authoritarian era in American life, say the 1960s, early 1970s, there's a lot of people challenging the whole silliness the Diagnostic Manual. You had One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest came out in 1975, 76. It was very, it was very almost mainstream to challenge the legitimacy of psychiatry. But what happens is in American, and so they're scared. American Psychiatric Association, they're frightened. Maybe they're going to go out of business. So they start to hook up with drug companies. They become very deeply connected. Almost, pharmaceutical companies almost annex the American Psychiatric Association. And as America sort of swings to a more authoritarian society, Ronald Reagan gets elected president in 1980. Puts down. You have a guy who's gets to office being a strong man who put down student revolts in California. His actor, at the time, people were just like couldn't believe it. But the country's swinging to a more authoritarian society, and so the American Psychiatric Association publishes the Diagnostic Manual, something called the DSM, and they follow suit and they create more sort of compliant diagnoses for people who are not compliant enough. So you have in the 1980 DSM this diagnosis, I'm in graduate school at the time, something called oppositional defiant disorder, ODD. And I look at this thing and I'm starting to laugh. I said, are you kidding me? The symptoms of this thing are often argues with adults, often refuse to comply with adult requests and rules, often irritating to adults. And none of these, the symptoms are not being even a juvenile delinquent. That's something else. That's conduct disorder. So these kids are doing nothing illegal. They're just they're a handful, right? And a lot of adults, they're creating some tension for them. And so initially I'm laughing, you guys, this has got to be a joke, and no one was taking it too seriously. But as the years went on, this has become like one of the major disruptive behavioral disorders, that along with conduct disorder, that kids are increasingly being medicated for. And they're being put on antipsychotic drugs, so these things like Seroquel, Risperdal, that kind of thing. And it's sort of shocking, actually, when you take a look at this huge burgeoning antipsychotic drug industry, which is just staggering. It's because it's not being, these heavily tranquilizing drugs are not being used on people who are even being labeled psychotic. But that's a whole other story. They're being used to control populations that create folks giving a hard time, so vulnerable populations. So you have not only these, especially foster kids who are giving folks a hard time. Almost all of these foster kids are getting diagnosed, with these disruptive behavioral disorders, but also old people in nursing homes, people in prisons and jails. It's an easy, relatively inexpensive way of controlling them. So, it's a pretty, frightening process for me, and that's part of why I say, I'm laughing, I'm embarrassed to be part of this profession, but I am. And so part of why I started speaking out in the early 1990s was really to separate myself from a profession that was really becoming one more spoke in the wheel of the sort of authoritarian society.
That's fascinating to me. I've just observed that myself in probably the last 15, 20 years, how kids are so easily medicated. And, I've looked at just like, I remember about 15 years or so ago, I was going through like a tough breakup and I went to a therapist and was feeling down about it. And his first instinct was just like, write me a prescription. And I was like, well, wait a minute, shouldn't I feel depressed after going through a breakup? Isn't that just like a normal human reaction? Why are we just pushing that down? And I think about the things that I see kids getting medicated for. Oh my God, I'm so lucky I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, because I would have been medicated if I was a kid in the late 90s or 2000s, for sure. And it's like, it's kind of, I look at it like, yeah, I was a teenager. I had a lot of hormones. I argued with authority figures, and that's what I did. That's what teenagers do.
Absolutely. One point that I make in that resisting legitimate authority is that because I profiled 20 famous anti-authoritarians, some very famous, some not so famous. But for example, Malcolm X, when he was a child, it was a very traumatic childhood that he went through. His father was killed. His mom, the family was broken up because his mom couldn't handle the financial situation. She ended up put in a psychiatric hospital. And he had this period of time where he moved from being a great student, he was a fantastic student when he was 12, 13 years old, to engaging in crime. This is like he was just really angry. He was pissed off at the world. And he moved into foster homes. And one of the points that I make in this book is nowadays, I can guarantee you that a young 13, 14, 15-year-old Malcolm X would have been, especially being a disruptive behavioral disorder who was a foster kid, almost for sure he would have been put on antipsychotic drugs. And the whole arc of his life would have changed. And I talk about a lot of other people in the book who are really super smart folks. Eugene Debs, very nice. People loved Eugene Debs, but he quit school when he was young. And a lot of other folks who had a kind of George Carlin quit school when he was young. Very different personalities, but they just school had nothing for them, and they left. Nowadays, these very intelligent folks, I don't think anybody disputes how intelligent people like George Carlin and Eugene Debs and several other folks I talk about, Lenny Bruce, all kinds of, not just political activists, comedians, all kinds of anti-authoritarians, that they would have been clearly, this is an intelligent kid and he doesn't want to go to school. He must be mentally ill. I mean, that's insane. And so that's really shifted around. And of course, there's a lot of reasons. Drug company power is part of it, but there's other reasons too. In a more authoritarian society, we want kids, to get used to being coerced, to being forced to do things they don't want to do early on in life. We want them forced. I was talking to a kid the other day, and I was asking this teenager, I was saying, when I was young, they made you in school raise your hand to go to the bathroom. I mean, sometimes they even made you ask, whether you're going to take a crap or taking a pee. You had to say number 2 or number 1. I was laughing. I said, do they still do that stuff in school? And he laughed. He says, well, now you get a limited amount of passes. This for this particular kid. We got a limited number of passes per semester. And I said, well, what happens if you run out of passes? What happens if you run out of passes and you have to take a shit? What do? They expect you to shit in your pants? And he started laughing. I said, no, I'm serious. What do they expect you to do? And he said, Bruce, so much of school is fucked up. We don't think about each fucked up thing. This is what he told me. And so part of this was common in the 1960s, 1970s for people. It was fairly mainstream to talk about the authoritarian nature of standard schooling, how it got people used to doing things they don't want to do, complying with authorities they had no respect. That was not radical stuff in the 1960s and 70s. Now when I say this, to a lot of young people, I've never even heard this before.
Wow, I mean, you shed such an amazing light on this, because I talk a lot on this show, but I've never heard this specific angle of using medication and antipsychotic medication on kids, because it's so clear to me that those in power, they don't want us paying attention. They don't want us protesting. You can have your little rallies on Saturdays, but they don't want us walking out on Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays and hurting their bottom line. That's why there's only one day, and it's not a holiday to have an election. The elections are never on a Sunday or Saturday or like they are in other industrialized countries. They want people paying more attention to American Idol than they do to what their state legislature is passing or not passing. And they want everybody just vape penning and taking medication and playing video games, and not because it makes perfect sense, because when everyone was rising up in the 60s and 70s, look what has happened since then. They have never put a war on TV since then, because they don't want people. The first Gulf War in 91, nope. The footage we saw coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, we're not going to see wounded soldiers and civilians dying, because we saw that in Vietnam when everyone would come home and watch their news in front of the dinner table. And so it's just fascinating to hear you talk about this and connect these dots in this way. My question is, how have you been received in the psychiatric community?
It's amazing I've survived. It's just by luck, because I sometimes I know a lot about. I think I know every dissident psychiatrist and psychologist in America, because there's one organization we all sort of hang out. It's called the International Society for Ethical Psychology and Psychiatry. But it's really a bunch of dissident shrinks. And I think the psychiatrists really have it a lot harder, because they're put in a position constantly where they're unprofessional if they don't drug and electroshock non-compliant people. And so I know, almost every dissenting psychiatrist in America has had their career really threatened. So I'll give you one example. He's not alive anymore. I met him a few years before he died, but a guy named Lauren Mosher. And he was a big shot. Again, in the 1960s, 1970s, you could be more of an anti-authoritarian shrink even. And so he came to the conclusion from his own personal experience, this guy Mosher, and from looking at the data, that these typical psychiatric hospitalizations for people who flipped out, had these psychotic breaks, they weren't working at all. They were just, if anything, making people worse. And so he said, well, why don't we try something different? And he had rose to a big shot position in the National Institute of Mental Health in terms of schizophrenia studies. He had a major position, and he was able to set up a study called the Soteria House, where they said, let's, instead of these psych hospitalizations, let's just put these folks into a respite house. We don't even need to have shrinks around. We'll just have like regular college kids and just let them chill. And we'll either give them no meds at all, very low-level meds, and let's see what happens. Let's experiment here. Well, it turned out these people did great. They did much better than people who went through typical psychiatric hospitalizations. And by the way, we can go off on this. This is a whole other tangent, and stuff like this is still going on around the world. But of course, this was highly threatening to psychiatry, highly threatening to pharmaceutical companies. So what happens to Lauren Mosher? He gets fired. 1980. That's his reward. He gets fired, and funding gets choked off for the Soteria House. And he's just one of many examples of dissenting psychiatrist. Thomas Sass probably is the most, a lot of people call him Sass, but the correct pronunciation is more like Sass. He's probably the most famous dissenting psychiatrist. Wrote a book called The Myth of Mental Illness in the early 1960s. He had tenure. I mean, they went after him with tenure. They tried to get rid of him even though he had tenure. And so there's a list. There's not a big list of dissenting psychiatrists because it's not that courageous a profession to begin with, and people have learned their lesson from these examples they've set. But that's what happens to these folks. They get marginalized. Now, for me, in this town here, I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, there's some of that. I don't have many shrink friends. My friends I have these few dissenting shrink friends around the country, around the world, so we all know one another. But, I haven't faced some very minor kind of shunning and ostracizing and stuff, but some people are really, their whole career's been threatened in a heavy way. And I guess in my case, even though I've written 5 books, I've written, almost 200 articles on Truth Out and Counterpunch and Alternate, Huffington Post, even some mainstream. I can't get a job as a university psychology professor. That's not going to happen for me. So that's the way they do that too. Just basically one of the things I talk about in that book is, drugging people or criminalizing them or assassinating them, that doesn't happen that much. Mostly what happens to guys like me, they're just ignored. They're just like, we're not going to give you a psychology professor job. We're not going to do that. And that's, so you get financially marginalized.
Yeah, and it's so funny. Your story is not unique. This is anyone that speaks out. This happens to anybody that calls. I mean, I've talked about this before. I was fired from a job. I've been a comedian and a filmmaker, and a little over a year ago, I was hired to do this like movie review game show for this big movie review company. And then they read my Twitter feed, which was mainly just calling out corporate Democrats in the state of California for selling out. They were trying to pass last June of 17 single-payer health care in the state of California, and California State Assembly Democrats, they crushed it. And I called them out for that on my Twitter feed, and I was fired from my job for that. So it's just sort of like you say, they just sort of, and they just said, we just don't want to deal with any controversy of any politics. We don't want anything to be too controversial. And that's the thing that they do. They marginalize you. They YouTube will demonetize videos if I talk about Yemen or Saudi Arabia or anything like that. Anytime calling out the war machine or the CIA or anything like that, automatically demonetized. And though that's a little form of censorship, they're still letting me put my videos up there, but they're just taking away the money. That's how they I always say they either buy you or they smear you or they marginalize you. That's if
Right, and part of what I'd like to get the message out, and I've been doing this for a few decades now, is a lot of people are so isolated out there. They feel like, well, I'm just being paranoid or I'm just being a victim here. And I've talked to enough people in almost every walk of life, and this is the game that goes on. I've talked to I've talked to a lot of young people doing what I do as a psychologist, and so they'll come in. For 3 decades, I get every couple of years, some kid comes and says, "I finally got a teacher I really love," and I go like, "Uh-oh, they're going to get fired next week." what happens, it almost always happens, that even among school teachers, that school teacher is willing to be interesting, which means taking some risks. You get up in front of a classroom, and you're going to, if you're afraid, which most of these teachers are terrified of, you're going to be boring, right? Fear creates boredom. So if you're going to be an interesting teacher, you're going to take some risks, and maybe you're going to say some things that are upsetting. And boom, I know nowadays, more and more, they're going to be out. So that teacher who's not totally fearful, playing it safe, they're going to be boring, they're going to keep their job. And so you take a look at that in almost every profession out there. Certainly, at a bigger political level, we can talk about the difference between Bernie Sanders and Ralph Nader. I mean, Ralph Nader was willing to say, hey, look, these Democrats and these Republicans, there's no difference between these guys, man. Almost, there's some differences on certain things about race and stuff like that, but on war and corporatism, there's no difference. And Ralph Nader tried his best. He's one of the anti-authoritarians I profiled. He tried his best for years to try to get these Democrats to just take one issue, one anti-corporatist issue. Gore, Clinton, none of those guys would talk to him at all. Yeah. And so finally he said, I wish somebody else runs, because I don't really want to do it. But finally he felt like, gee, somebody's got to take these guys on. And here's a guy who in the 60s and 70s, he took on General Motors, the most powerful. I mean, they would be like, nowadays it's like, Amazon, they were the most powerful corporation in the world. He took on General Motors in the 60s and 70s, and he won. He beat them. He won even a lawsuit against them. It was a very different world, but here he takes on the Democratic Party in 2000, and he's shunned. He can't even make a living. He can't even, not that the guy needs much. He lives on almost no money, so he's not, it's not killing him financially here, but he used to go out and speak and raise money for his consumer, causes. He can't do that anymore. And Bernie Sanders, he learned that lesson. He repeats this over and over again. I'm not going to be Ralph Nader. Well, what is he saying? I'm too scared. I'm too scared to take on what I know. I know Hillary Clinton. My God, how could you be more disgusting than Hillary Clinton? Best friends with Henry Kissinger, one of the great warmongers, war criminals in the history of the world. We can go on about Hillary Clinton. And Ernie, and his poor, it's almost pathetic. Bernie Sanders, whose hero was Eugene Debs. He did a documentary in his 30s on Eugene Debs. It's his hero, who Eugene Debs said, look, he learned at a very early age, and Bernie Sanders knows all this, not only from his own life, from studying Eugene Debs, that the Democrats threw Eugene Debs in prison. Woodrow Wilson, before that, Cleveland threw him in prison when he was leading a labor strike. And so, Eugene Debs ran. He took on the Democrats. He knew that there was no difference. Bernie Sanders knew all of this stuff. He knows this stuff, but he's afraid. He said, I don't want to be another Ralph Nader. And he's right. They would have ruined his career. They would have blamed him for Trump winning, and he would have been a pariah, as opposed to now people still love him in the liberal progressive world. And that's the sad thing about American society. You see all over the place. Anybody who kicks up some tension, create some tension by telling some truth, they're going to get in trouble at the very high level there that I just talked about, or at low levels of very people that you've never even heard of.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, like Chris Hedges and Cornel West talk about, Bernie missed his opportunity when he lost the nomination, or was cheated out of the nomination. He could have ran as an independent and really shaken things up in this country. But I agree with that. It's such an excellent point you're making, how he just didn't want to be like Ralph Nader. But
even now, I know. Go ahead.
I want to ask you this question. What correlation do you see between the over-medication or over-prescribing of these antipsychotics and the rising suicide rates?
Well, it's hard to, correlation, any good scientist knows correlation doesn't mean causation. Okay. So you can't say for sure that these rising, mostly people talk about this point that you're making in terms of increasing antidepressant use and leading to actually more suicide. And certainly that's going on. Now, is that causation or is it just correlation? Well, certainly we know it's not helping. So you got more and more people receiving medication, being put on these antidepressants, and you've got suicide rates just staggeringly increasing. So while you can't say off of that that's causing it, you can generally say, well, we're not helping. And it's not just that. In general, my whole mental health profession is another reason why I'm embarrassed by it. It is one of the, besides being used by pharmaceutical companies as basically salespeople, another thing that we do in the mental health profession is that we provide them with these, quotes, mental illness reasons why people are suicidal, depressed, angry, all that sort of stuff, as opposed to saying like, wait a minute, these kids are not paying attention because they're bored in school. These teachers don't even want to be here. It's boring. It's not anything to do with ADHD, mental illness, or these people are depressed. What we do know statistically, you're going to be much more likely to be depressed. This is not going to be news to you. This is common sense. If you're in poverty, if you're unemployed, if you've got a pre-felony record, if you've got some overwhelming pain in your life, you're more likely to be depressed. Some of that pain is political pain, all right? We just know all that stuff. And so part of the reason, again, why I separate myself out from my profession is they don't talk about this enough. Because if they did, then they would be more threatening to the corporate state. The corporate state keeps mental health, psychiatry, and psychology around, not just because we're salespeople for drug companies, but also, too, because we offer an explanation for people's malaise that doesn't threaten the nature of the fact that this culture and this society is miserable for the majority of people. I mean, it just is. Most people are walking around eating shit to survive. Not everybody. I don't know, LeBron James maybe not, but most people are.
Well, no, you bring up a great point. They just did a new study about how much capitalism and this toxic capitalism that we have in America, this unregulated capitalism, is bringing about so much depression, because no matter how hard you work, it doesn't mean anything. You can have 2-3 jobs, and as we've said, the 60% of the population doesn't even have $1,000 in savings. So that's going to make you depressed. No matter what you do, it doesn't seem to work. I mean, I went through some of that myself. I went through, as a direct result of Bush and Obama, I lost my home. And that was supposed to be my retirement and all that stuff. That's one of the reasons why I chose to start doing this show, also at the behest of Jimmy Dore. Was because I felt broken. I felt like I'm a failure. I must have done something wrong. How do you lose your home in the wealthy America? I must be an idiot. I must have screwed up. And the reality is, I might have made some mistakes, but I was flat out lied to. And there was $700 billion in stimulus money to Bush, $700 to Obama. They both let the banks run wild. They didn't prosecute anybody. So it's hard to not feel like, man, everything's broken and there's nothing you can do about it. And I'm somebody who, I meditate, I do yoga, I go surfing, I do all of these positive things to release positive chemicals that are already in my body. And it's still hard, let alone in a society where you're told to drink and smoke weed and cigarettes and put all this other crap into your body.
Well, this is another reason that a lot of people have not just embarrassed by the mental health profession, they're angry with it. And I know there's a huge group of people, I don't know if your audience has ever heard the term psychiatric survivors or people with lived experience, but there's a huge group of people out there growing all the time of ex-patients who get it, that wait a minute here, that they've been told that they're defective. Right. That they've been told they have this biochemical brain imbalance or something like that, or that there's something genetically wrong with them. Some way, or form, in some way, psychiatry creates the stigma of mental illness. They always go around railing around, there's nothing more politically correct than so we got to end the stigma of mental illness. But they create it by telling people who've been deeply traumatized that they are defective. They've got some chemical brain imbalance. There's something genetically wrong with them, as opposed to saying, that's what happens when you're traumatized, and you can be traumatized by parents, by abuse, you could traumatized by bullying, but you could also be traumatized by poverty. You could also be traumatized by a war. There's all kinds of political reasons, and these naturally result in what these guys call mental illnesses. They're just really natural human reactions. Some of us get very depressed, depending on our temperament. Some of us get very agitated and angry. Some of us, we start to wig out in all kinds of ways. So depending on our temperament, we're going to have different reactions. But all of us, being human, if we're traumatized, we're going to have these things that these guys call mental illnesses so that they can make money off of and not talk about what's causing them the traumas. But they're really just normal human reactions to extreme events.
That's a great way you put that, and to anybody watching out there, like I've gone and used like EMDR and stuff like that for trauma. I found that to be quite effective. I just will not take any medications. That's just me personally. So, let me ask you this as we wrap up here. What would you suggest to anybody watching this who's like, what do I do? I either thinking about, I've had a bad experience with psychiatric help or medication, or I'm feeling a certain way, and where do I go? Where would I go for help? What would you say to somebody that's watching this right now?
Well, if they're lucky enough, and in major cities, people like, you can go on certain websites, madinamerica.com, there's certain websites, that there's certain areas you have support groups of people who are peer support, genuine people who've been through it. And really, that's the best thing. Whether you've been in a problematic trauma, in war trauma, in war, or different kinds of traumas, to be around people who are not viewing you as disease, who've been through it themselves, and can give you that support in many of these situations for free, that's great. For a lot of other people, there's a lot of different areas, different ways that they move through it. Now, some people, they take the edge off with drugs, and I don't mean to be, a lot of people say booster pill shaming. That's another term, not so much for guys your age, but, for Gen Xers. I assume you're a Gen Xer, but guys who are like the millennials, it's like you can't be criticizing of anybody using drugs, that you're shaming their pill use. You're a pill shamer. I'm not doing it at all. I just am into ending the hypocrisy of it. I mean, I know plenty of people out there, their lives are so messed up. In order to take the edge off so they could function at all, they're using some pot, they're using some Prozac, they're using something. But for me, it's like, let's not be hypocritical about the psychiatric drug, illegal drug differences here. Some people are getting to such bad shape here that they have to just take the edge off some which way to be able to get through the day. And I totally get that. And for me, for those folks, I would talk about like what we call harm avoidance. So if you're like, which started with people who are like needle use, heroin, IV heroin users, at least use clean needles. So, use your own gut when you're dealing with mental health professionals. Don't let them over-medicate you, okay? Just use what you need to get through the day.
Okay. Well, folks, Bruce, thank you so much for spending your time with us. I'll put his website, brucelevine.net. That'll be in the show notes below, everybody. You can get his book, Resisting Illegitimate Authority, and read more about him. There's a lot of articles and his other books and video clips that are all on his website that are in the show notes below. Bruce, thank you so much for taking time out of your day and sharing this. It was very eye-opening, man, and I love doing interviews like this. The show has... the people I've interviewed and the subjects that have been suggested to me to talk about, my eyes have been opened wide up in the 19 or so months I've been doing this show. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's fun talking to you.
All right, man. Have a great day.
You too, man.